It's really nice to see you all here tonight for what's sure to be a very special and enlightening talk. I'm Jo Reinert, Registrar and Collections Manager and Interim Curator at the Ulrich. And it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Lesley Dill, who is a multidisciplinary and prolific artist. Dill works at the intersection of language and fine art in printmaking, sculpture, installation, and performance, exploring the power of words to cloak and reveal the psyche. Her traveling exhibition, Wilderness, Light Sizzles Around Me, is organized by the Figge Art Museum in Davenport, Iowa, and made possible by Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And it's on view here at the Ulrich, which is its 6th venue, through December 2nd. The exhibition represents Dill's ongoing investigation into the significant voices and personas of America's past and early America's fears of the wilderness out there and the wilderness within. In past works, she's transformed the emotional writings of Emily Dickinson, Salvador Espriu, Tom Slay, Franz Kafka, and Rainer Maria Rilke, among others, into works of paper, wire, horsehair, foil, bronze, and music. Works that awaken the viewer to the physical intimacy and power of language itself. Dill has had over 100 solo exhibitions. Her works are in the collections of many major museums like the Met, and MoMA, and the Whitney, and the Ulrich. In 2017, she was named a Fellow of the Guggenheim Foundation, and she's a Joan Mitchell Foundation Creating a Living Legacy artist and grant recipient. Her opera, Divide Light, based on the poems of Emily Dickinson, was performed in San Jose in 2008, and in April of 2018, the new Camerata Opera Company performed a restaged version in New York City, which was captured in a full-length film by Ed Robbins. And we'd like to thank Tallgrass Film Association for partnering with us on a free screening of that film, which is tomorrow, no, not tomorrow, it's not Friday yet, it's Saturday at 1 o'clock at the Tallgrass Film Center at the Lux. And both Lesley and Ed will be there for questions and discussions afterwards, so we hope to see you there. The Ulrich would also like to thank the Wichita Art Museum for collaborating on a second program in connection with the exhibition, which features Lesley Dill in conversation with artist and friend Beth Littman. That talk is tomorrow night at WHAM, beginning at 7 o'clock. And we'd also like to quickly thank the Wichita Marriott for its generous support of this program as well. Now I'm going to pass the mic, so to speak, to Lesley. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Jo. You are the perfect distance from the microphone, which I'm going to try to emulate. I'm very happy to be here in Wichita and to see all of you here tonight, and to see all of you with the historical people of the Wilderness exhibition. First, let's see, next. Okay. Next. Does it work? Jo is my clicker, but this is when we find these things out. So in the meanwhile, I will say that the city of Wichita occupies the traditional homelands of several Native American nations, including the Kiowa, the Kaw, the Osage, Wichita, the people of the 7 Council Fires, and many others. The Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, the Kickapoo Tribe in Kansas, Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and especially I honor the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri and Kansas and in Oklahoma. So I think that Jo is going to sit next to me like my child. And and we're just going to see what we do. Perfecto. Okay. I love working as a team. And here we are, right now, working as a team. Okay. I also have new glasses, so I have to hold this up really high. Okay. Next. And this is the lands upon which they lived. Next. And I especially want to thank my friend and fantastic artist, John Quick-to-See Smith, for opening the door to my heart to investigating our Native American people. Please let me know if you can't hear me. Thank you. Okay there. See, a team. I think up a little higher though, right? We have a vote. But stay with me. Joe's here, and you can. We're going to get through this and drive this car. I think maybe I even don't need my glasses. No, I do need my glasses. Okay. Jean. Jean is a citizen of the Confederate Salish and Kootenai Nation, and she had her first New York retrospective this year called Memory Map at the Whitney Museum of Art, and gave a fantastic talk. Next. A good woman. So tonight, I am fervent before you. I am fervent before you tonight. And how did I come to feel so intensely about this exhibition, this journey, wilderness, light sizzles around me? It first happened through an unnoticed corner of my mind. This unnoticed corner of my mind opened up to an awareness. Next. So this is how it happened. I've been working in my art and studio and also in my opera with the words of the poet Emily Dickinson for many, many years. From her quiet inward life up in Amherst, Massachusetts, she hid away. Next. Passages filled with wonder, contradiction, and visionary strangeness. Next. Her poignant and haunting words landed deep in my psyche. Take all away from me, but leave me ecstasy, she said. This red ecstasy dress is the finale dress of my opera. Next. And acted as a reminder of the deep, dark woods of Maine, where I grew up, and the Adirondacks. She wrote, I'm going to sprinkle lines of Emily Dickinson throughout my talk, so here's a wicked one that I like. She wrote, split the lark, and you'll find the music. Next. Then one day, a random thought came, like a new bird landing on a branch of my mind. This was the thought, or rather the question. This is one of those dumb questions that you don't really want to reveal in a public talk. But here it is. You don't want to entertain it because you feel so dumb afterwards. So after decades of working with Dickinson's poetry, the thought came to me, when did she actually write? I realized I didn't really know. Was she from John Donne, Walt Whitman? When did she write her poetry? And I had never asked myself this because I think of poetry as existing alone, as if it's in a poetic geography all its own, and is timeless and is not bound by land. Nevertheless, this blank place in my mind became filled with a huge hunger to know more about the history of our country. Because if I didn't know when Emily Dickinson wrote, what else did I not know about our country? So I wanted to know, and I started, and then just kept going. It took 8 years to make the work in the other room. So let's start with the theme of wilderness. I think the very sound of the word wilderness has a ringing potency. I'm hearing it. Wilderness. I feel a mix of invitation and also foreboding. An invitation into something unknown, unpredictable, yet nourishing. Next. Oh, wait, back, please. Oh, where is that? Can you go back another one? Huh. Okay. Let's next. So we can go back to the couch. Okay. So this is what I did for 8 years in addition to a lot of sewing, is I read and read and read. And I filled myself with the history of the people at a certain time in our country's life, and a certain kind of people at a certain time in our country's life. Next. This is it. For the entry banner, I wanted a more primal sense of this word, wilderness. So I researched it, and I went for its ancient source, wilderness. It's a very old Norwegian word that combines deer, next, with wild, next, which meant simply uncontrolled, as well as referring to boiling water, as one could see. Next. This image of the deer leaping with the ancient word for wilderness is for me the anchor point of this exhibition of early visionary Americans. Next. My deep New England roots linked me by family, as many of you here, by family to become fascinated with the early white settlers facing the wilderness. As I researched, I found that these religious New England people coming from Europe became obsessed with, next, salvation and grace, as well as with the fearful, fearful wilderness, next, out there, surrounding them, and the wilderness inside us, shadowy places of both deviltry but also divinity. To me these days, I think more of the deviltry within those settlers' minds who took, as though entitled, these forest lands from Native Americans. For them, the forests were not places of shadows and devils. Next. But a home, a refuge, and a sacred place. Next. When you wander through the work tonight or tomorrow, or you have already, I'd like you to think of it as a kind of walk through the woods, as if the people are trees of information and knowledge. Next. And here, Randy, is Horace Pippin. You search and you find phrases and images interwoven into the banners and cloth sculptures. Next. I hope when you encounter my themes of wilderness in the American past, that you recognize why it is such a powerful touchstone of inspiration for me, and how it still resonates in this ever-changing present. Next. When I asked, I asked my family, when did my own family arrive here in the wilderness from England? My cousin Annie sent me a genealogy of our family, and it turned out to be that we arrived in Massachusetts in 1636. I looked at that time period, and I thought, who was alive for me then to look at and to be interested in, as myself, a woman now interested in history, interested in poetry, in reading, and of course, theology. So I first turned to Anne Hutchinson. Yeah, there she is. Thus, in 1637, Anne Hutchinson, wife, mother of 15 children, was put on trial for religious heresy. Why was this? It is because the Boston Calvinist male ministers excommunicated her for teaching in her home from her vision of true grace. Next. On the boat coming over, she had seen a bird. Now, I read that the bird she saw was a dove, but being a New Englander, I'm pretty sure she must have seen a seagull. and when she saw this bird, she had a vision. The glimpse of this bird at that moment opened up the entire world for her to see the kingdom of God laid out before her. So she began to teach from this experience, grounded by it. Next. Grounded by this grace. She said in her defense at her trial, if any come to my house to be instructed in the ways of God, what rule have I to put them away? Do you think it not lawful for me to teach women? And why do you call me to court? These ministers scorned her for this personal and ecstatic relationship to God. They scorned her with very intense language. Next, which I'm going to read to you. This is what John Winthrop said to her. He called her this American Jezebel, seeing the fluentness of her tongue and her willingness to open herself, to divulge opinions, and to sow her seed in us, which I think is something of a biological puzzle. But they said that, and to sow her seed in us. She had rather been a husband than a wife, and a preacher than a hearer. And they made her run away with all her children, and she had a lovely husband. So she went to Narragansett, Rhode Island. Next. And, oh, there it is. See? It's so sexual, isn't it? These Calvinist ministers, the fluentness of her tongue, her willingness to open herself and divulge opinions and to sow her seed in us. That's like I think like that, they should be arrested. Next. About 100 years later, in the 1730s, the magnetic Jonathan Edwards, who's out there as well, was preaching to Northampton, Massachusetts. He would vehemently dedicate himself to exactly what Anne Hutchinson was excommunicated for. And what was that? It was a personal experience of God and transcendence. I would ask you, listening to me now, have you ever had a moment where you felt a personal connection to something larger than yourself, a bigger experience than just being ourselves? Next. He wrote with such intense imagery and words about his yearning for grace and transcendent experience. He electrified his church through gentle coaxing, and mostly he's known for his mostly terrifying sermons about hell and repentance, and then salvation, which then, for these Puritans, was a rite of passage from affliction to grace. Here are some of his more, his congregations would just go crazy. He would inflame them with absolute fear that they were going to hell and they would never, ever get out of this dark, dark tunnel. So, next. So here are some of his more intense words, which evidently spoke not in a thundering voice, but in a quiet, involving voice. This is told to me by my friend here, Catherine Reckless, a Jonathan Edwards scholar at Fordham University. Okay, next. Okay, so this is, where is Ed? There you are, okay. So if I were Jonathan Edwards and Ed was one of my people, I might say to him very quietly, so he would get upset. You, sinner, in the hands of an angry God. God holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire. He abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. Sweetheart. Okay, next. No, he was known for these sermons. You know, there was a burned over time when there were these times when the entire Midwest and New England would wake up all at once and fall down fainting and screaming and hoping that they would go be saved and have grace. So this is what we're talking about tonight for those sculptures out there. Sinner in the hands of it. God holds you. Okay. All right, loathsome insect. Next. Okay. On the front of his sculpture are other words that Jonathan Edwards wrote. He himself had a vision of grace. That's why he felt so fervent, so intensely about what his parishioners felt. He wanted them to feel what he felt, come hell or high water. So he wrote, "My soul, a secret place of my own in the woods." Next. Thank you. Where he would go to receive this feeling, to see the wonders of the wilderness of the world. Next. On his back are painted the words of contemporary friend and poet Tom Slay, in which he, our friend, the poet, portrays himself, next, as the little dangling spider, which is painted on the back here in gray. And he calls his poem, which is very long, Portrait of Myself as Jonathan Edwards Spider. Thank you. And there is Tom. From Mr. Slay also comes the second half of the title of this exhibition. So it's Wilderness, and then his words, light sizzles around me. Thank you, Tom. Indeed, each of these historical people here for me, I always think that's going to be my phone. You know, it happened once. It was like rang and rang and rang, and it was like right here, my phone. So, okay. Each of these historical people here for me are inflamed with purpose and can say, light sizzles around me. Next. Early white European settlers in the Northeast arrived into, as Mary Rowlandson wrote in her 1675 captivity narrative. Next. She wrote, so the Native Americans that they came, that she came into, and her people came into a vast howling wilderness. She was captured and she was held in captivity by the Narragansett for 11 weeks. And she wrote, next, that not one offered her the least miscarriage. They didn't harm her, they didn't touch her. In fact, they employed her to sew the white shirts of the chief. Next, here she is. Fearful of the deep woods, the colonists were obsessed with a yearning for a confirmed salvation and safety, and afraid of out there and the Lucifers of the wilderness in here. The settlers, eager for safety and greedy for land, began a systematic annihilation of Native American people. Next. Yep. To these Native Americans, the forests and mountains and plains held no fear. These were a refuge of beauty and home. And I will say, this is a spectacular country. You know, here in Wichita, I just can't stop looking at the sky. I mean, it's just so there. Next. I honor tonight. So in the process of making this work, I became friends with a number of Native American people who would tell me about themselves. And we have Ray A. Youngbear's poem here in the exhibition. And he wrote me that he's wearing here a modern day replication of what his great-grandparents would wear. Tribal-based finery. Next. And it has been an incredible honor for me to make an image of famed Native American Sauk warrior Black Hawk, or in his language, Makatai Mishi Kyak Kyak. For this, you know, you can't, I learned, Jean, quick to see Smith, said, no, Lesley, you just, maybe I say it here. She said, you can't just make an image of someone who is from a Native American nation or tribe. You have to go and you have to ask permission. I said, no, I said, oh, I can't, I'm so shy, I can't do that. She said, you have to. You have to walk in you have to learn to walk in someone else's shoes, and it will be wonderful for you. So I made new friends who are early people of this country. So Black Hawk, for this, I enlisted the permission and help and advice of Joaquin Hamilton Youngberg. Next. So I thought the tribal historian would be this really, really tiny old guy with really wrinkled skin. And instead, there's this hunky dude who said on the phone, he said, are you near your computer? And I said, yeah. He said, okay, so if you go to page 15 of my Facebook page and go 4 over, and then you'll see me holding a bird. So with his wide knowledge, I checked every single detail of the image, you know, from the beads to the buckskin, and I also unwittingly corrected mistakes that were long held, which I'm so happy to tell you about. Next, here's a painting by George Catlin in which he portrays Black Hawk holding horizontally on his arm what looks something like, when I looked at it, I thought, oh look, he's holding a dead crow. Kind of, ooh. And, but Mr. Hamilton Youngberg taught me that the bird you see here in this painting, this is not just some ordinary dead bird. And it's the true way it should be held is this way. This is a head, it represents a head and tail feather fan used as a sacred ceremonial object, which helps them to fan the human spirit up to the great spirit in the sky. Next. Oh, here he is. So here he is holding a feather fan, and I will tell you more next. Here is a detail of the work that went into the feathers. Next. So what is this bird? It is a bird. It is obviously not an alive bird. It is a dead bird. It is made from the hollowed out body and feathers of an immature golden eagle. Not that easy to come by. They are protected. Joaquin himself, who you see here, holding one, is making a head and tail feather fan again, and he's going to line it with soft leather, and it can be lined with also with fabric or velvet. So I was thrilled in a way to discover that George Catlin was incorrect in how he portrayed this sacred feather fan. So we did this research, and through this research, you know, you find these little tiny bits of truth, and little tiny bits of truth always feel like they're very dazzling. So Black Hawk spoke out in his autobiography that was written from his words. He said these words, which are on his banner. Next. This, yep. And next. How smooth must be the language of the whites when they can make right look like wrong and wrong right. They coiled themselves among us like snakes. Have you seen the Martin Scorsese movie? That would sort of. Next. Known in history as a warrior, Black Hawk's parting words, however, are about peace. He said, "May the Great Spirit keep our people and whites at peace." This is a sincere wish of Black Hawk. The stealing of the Native American land is the first big stain on our soil. The second, as we all know, next, is slavery. Here is Sojourner Truth, or my version of Sojourner Truth. Excuse me, allergies. Sojourner Truth is an abolitionist heroine sewn deep inside our history of enslavement. Early enslaved in the North, she became a famed speaker and leader in the abolitionist movement, as did John Brown. When she achieved freedom, next, God gave her a new name. He gave her the name Sojourner in a vision, because her mission, he told her, was to travel up and down the coast and the country, preaching of God, truth, and liberty. Then, after a while, God gave her a second name, Truth. Next. How wonderful to have a name that is an exhortation to mission. Aren't I a woman, she said. Now, tonight, I will tell you what was the context for this well-known phrase, which I'm happy to say, aren't I a woman? I am. So Sojourner was very tall. She was about 6'1" and very powerful as a speaker. And in that era, women were not, I just want to make sure I have the right glasses here, were not supposed to speak out loud by themselves. And her audience would be mostly men, because the women weren't really allowed to come out and listen to speakers. So there would not be many women amongst them. So the men, they teased her. They said, you cannot be a woman. You are tall and you speak with a deep voice like a man. You are not a woman. And she said, aren't I a woman? And she began to unbutton the buttons of her blouse, and she opened her blouse and she revealed her breasts, and she said, aren't I a woman? So I think that is quite shocking and startling and amazing. I share that with you. Next. Good. I'm going to speak to you now of two, almost done in a way. I'm going to speak to you now of two incredible men of this time, just around 1860, Dred Scott and John Brown. Dred Scott and John Brown, some say, launched the American Civil War. So, how was this? How did this happen? Next. First, let's speak about John Brown the Wild, the abolitionist preacher and father of 22 children. Easy for him. From the Adirondacks, where I summered as a child. Next. He had a vision. So almost everyone in this exhibition had a vision that was their machine, their healing machine for their own soul. He had a vision in church that caused him to raise his right hand and pledge, I, John Brown, come with the Lord's blessing to free every colored man in the territory. You are free. Follow me, children. Next. But you know, he is of the far edge, a seer from the wilderness of the Adirondacks. Prophetic, inspiring, and violent. Next. Oh no, yep, we're there. Herman Melville wrote, by the streaming beard is known Weird John Brown, the meteor of the war. John Brown felt that violence was needed to begin the slave liberation movement. So, because he had so many sons, he took them and others, and he went and massacred slaveholders and also some black people in Bleeding, Kansas, the Potawatomi massacre, and finally a raid on the Federal Armory at is Potawatomi near here? Is it? It's north, more north. And finally a raid at the Federal Army at Harper's Ferry. He was tried for treason and picked up by Robert E. Lee and hung in 1859. I read that he was the first person to be tried for treason in the United States history. Next. Yep. In my sculpture here, these beard hairs form a kind of, for me, a waterfall, a wild rage, like a spewing of words going down and fervent. Next. Each individual horsehair strand is knotted actually to lengthen it. That job alone took months and months to complete by myself, my interns, and my assistants. Next. So right now would be a very good place to thank the women and men who I worked with. Here next to me was, I really love these women. Here next to me was my studio manager at the time, Sarah Ingber. Behind me is Hae Min Young, who I still work with, who recently got married in both Korea and India to GV. She's Korean and GV is from India. So they got married in Korea with a full family, and they got married in Amritsar with a full Indian family. Anyway, so their world comes into my world, which comes into your world. And then Ayun and Isabella next. So here we are, a smaller studio team, pre-pandemic. Hae Min and Alana Sears, the expert painter. We continued to work throughout the pandemic remotely. Next. I became a really good friend of FedEx, who would FedEx things to Queens and to New Jersey. And here is myself and Sarah working on Black Hawk, masked and with the windows wide open during the pandemic. Next. And for me, that embrace of obsessive touch, that sense of repeated tactility, is a common part of my practice. Next. I love that almost meditative sense of repetitive action. Next. There she is for you, Anne Hutchinson, of time invested, the touch of the hand. Next. Whether it is in the beard or the clothing. Next. Or the thousands of hand-painted letters that fill this exhibition. That impulse holds true in nearly all of my work, including the opera. Next. And now, almost done we are with this talk. Here is my version of Dred Scott. And I knew his name, but I didn't really know his place in history. But now I know it, so I will tell you. So first of all, there's the historical Dred Scott, but there is also, next, a fantastic contemporary artist who calls himself Dred Scott, and I met him 20, 30 years ago, and now it made complete sense to me that he took on a name of mission, like Sojourner Truth. So here we have images of his flag. A man was lynched by police yesterday, and his recent reenactment of the 1811 slave rebellion in New Orleans. Next. So how do we know the historical Dred Scott? We know of him indirectly. We know of him because he and his wife Harriet and their two girls here, Eliza and Lizzie, filed a freedom suit in St. Louis, Missouri in 1847. You know, the country was peppered with some states where you could be a slave and some states where you could sue for freedom. So it was a patchwork of yeses and nos. Next. Thank you. Why did they file on this particular date? Yeah, it is possible that because that it was then because their daughter Eliza was almost 8. And 8 years old, it was a routine time that young girls would be put up for slavery. Next. I researched their winding, circuitous path like a river. Next. Dred and his wife Harriet and their two girls, Eliza and Lizzie. Here is their story. Next. I hope we get this right. They filed and then they lost. Next. And then they won. Next. And then they lost. Next. And then they refiled. And then they lost. Next. Good job. Very nice job. And now they and we all finally lost really big when the infamous Dred Scott decision happened 10 years later in 1857. In this particular court, the Supreme Court, our United States Supreme Court, they ruled against the family, saying that black people from all over the country, that black people were inferior beings and could not have any rights more than a piece of merchandise or a donkey. Next. This inhuman decree threw oil on the fires that soon after became the American Civil War. Lincoln. Next. Okay, now. So I thought, okay, Emily Dickinson. But Emily Dickinson actually wrote most of her poems during the American Civil War. Her heated, ecstatic, combustible poetry was written, most of it, during the years of the Civil War in her quiet little house in Amherst. Next. Sojourner Truth, who you see here on the right, lived in Northampton, only 6 miles away from Emily Dickinson in Amherst. And also writing at this time was Walt Whitman here in Orange. So, I would read book after book after book, and you go, oh, so they lived 6 miles apart from each other. Was it at the same time? Did they have coffee? You just, you read these books, you think of history, but you can't apply our social modes to that time. And that time was also so immersed, the early days, in religion. What you could do, what you could think, who you could be, how bad you could be. Next. And Nathaniel Hawthorne in Massachusetts. Next. Text has such a such a transformative power. Those visual twists of letters that transmit emotions and thoughts inside us. So this exhibition is about reading, reading, reading. And I guess really this talk is about listening, listening, listening. So thank you for that. And reading and hearing the words of others. Next, I'd like to tell you, this is almost the last person, I'd like to tell you about Mother Ann Lee. Mother Ann Lee was the founder of the Shakers, called the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, as Mother Ann Lee. This was in upstate New York in the 1700s, coming from England. Today, the Shakers are known mostly for their furniture and their celibate and communal life. There are actually 2 Shakers living in Maine. They were also generations ahead of their time in practices such as accepting African Americans and Native Americans into the community, especially during the Civil War. Next. Here on Mother Ann Lee, dressed in traditional Shaker yellow, is an image of the blazing tree, an iconic image from the Shakers. Next. Sister Cahoon, who was one of my favorite people. She had, in 1845, she had a vision. So after Mother Ann Lee died, her community was bereft, just bereft, that their leader had died and left them. So about 20, 30 years after Mother Ann Lee died, some of the young women and young men of the community at night in the services, they were given visions, and they were often given visions to paint. And it would always be 2 people. One would hear the vision and tell it to the other person, and the other person would paint it. So Sister Cahoon did paint, not this blazing tree, but she painted her own blazing tree. Right there, had a vision after Mother Ann Lee died, and she wrote, "I saw a whole tree as the angel held it before me. I felt curious when I took hold of it, lest the blaze should torch my hand." The vision was so real, she thought she would be burnt. For me, this burning tree embodies the flame of ecstatic experience that gave the Shakers their name. In England, the Quakers really didn't like the Shakers, and they told the Shakers to move out. They said, you guys, you make too much noise. And we Quakers, we were really quiet. So the Quakers were really instrumental in kicking the Shakers out of England and having them come here. So they would have rousing parties, I guess, at night where they would dance. Next. Look at that, dancing like that. Nevertheless celibate, but ecstatic and high and having visions and in trance and stomping, stomping, stomping. Where am I? Okay, next. So there's her banner. Next. Now I have told, no, so this is my version of Mother and Lee in heaven. But I told you a story of one woman speaking in public, Sojourner Truth, who had to define herself as a valid woman speaker in public. Mother Ann Lee also went on the road preaching. At one time, also, her audience of mainly men, she was this demure, of course, you know, the Shakers, everything covered, everything everywhere covered. This little woman, she was stripped completely naked by men who said that she should not be speaking out loud about the second coming of Jesus Christ. So, I don't know. It was an unexpected part of reading American history that these women speakers speaking out loud, as I am speaking to you tonight, would get stripped bare or had to show their breasts and prove that they were women and what their identity was. Next. So here is an example of Mother Ann Lee, in my mind, alive, and then her spirit in the era of manifestations. So at the next, yeah, at the bottom of her dress are the two small figures I was speaking of. They are the later helpers. They were called the instruments of the Shakers. Next. And there they are, two of them. Next. I learned a lot about the Shakers in 2019 at a Henry Luce Foundation Shaker colloquium in New York City that lasted for a year and a half with amazing people. Our motto was, the Shakers are not just a chair. And I want to thank here Sally Prummy, Director of Divinity at Yale, for her friendship and her guidance and her book about the Shakers, which I've read 3 times. So doing this project about history, I know I told you that I read all these books, but you know, I also read all these people. And I became friends through the Shaker colloquium. And then I asked them about Jonathan Edwards, and they gave me the name of an author. And then we did have coffee. And so for me, the experience of this exhibition of these dazzling men and women is about reading, but it's really about experiencing other people who have read and who believe and feel the truth of the history of the people and the sadness of our history. So how have I come myself to have comfort with these searching, rapturous people? Next. Yeah, next too, yeah. It is because I myself had an unasked for experience as a 14-year-old girl in Maine, looking out my window at the oak leaves on a tree in early winter. Craig, where are you? There you are, the oak leaves. What happened next? Suddenly I became all eye. My screen was dark. Next. I can't. You can ask me about it later, but I've decided not to talk about my visionary experience anymore in my talk because I get so vulnerable. This is one of the reasons, though, that I am so attracted to Sister Gertrude Morgan, who lived in New Orleans from 1900 to 1988. Here she is, painting herself as a street preacher in New Orleans. Also, she's an artist. And she uses words and images together. So I thought, soul sister she is to me. And, next. There she is, Revelation. Next. Sister Gertrude Morgan had a vision. Also, like the others, she had a vision from God that she was to become the bride of Jesus, and she was to wear white the rest of her life. which she did, and to preach the word of God. Next. So here she is in this exhibition. Next. There she is. Next. And I also relied greatly on this book, Tools of Her Ministry, by the extraordinary Bill Fagley, here hugging me. Next. And to close, okay, now where is that guy who has a Horace Pippin painting? Randy, right? Okay. To close, I had to include another artist because why? Because I'm an artist, so I had to include another artist. So you know I'm inclined to visionary, mystical people. You know I'm inclined to words and poetry. You know those are the reasons why I made all this work. But also, I am an artist, so I wanted to do homage to Horace Pippin, who I think is an incredible artist. So he lived from 1888 to 1946. He fought in France in World War I with a segregated unit called Harlem Hellfighters. He wrote, "I can never forget suffering and will never forget sunset. The war brought out all of the art in me." Next. Badly injured, Mr. Pippin was awarded the Purple Heart and by France the Croix de Guerre. He returned home to Pennsylvania during the height of Jim Crow America. Next. He was then active in an early movement among African Americans called Victory Abroad and Victory at Home. You can see the double V's, so he would insert them in many of his paintings. Yeah. Next. And it's the same with this vase. The double V's are part of the painting. Next. And here is a painting by Horace Pippin of John Brown going to his hanging. Among his paintings are ones of Abraham Lincoln, John Brown, The Holy Mountain, The Intense Mr. Prejudice, Marianne Anderson, and to close. But you know, before I close, also, it seemed ultimately that all the people in the room were related in one way or another through the words that I read, the people that I spoke to, the fact that this exhibition was born half in New York and half in Iowa, which is the home of the Meskwaki, and where I found the incredible Joaquin Hamilton Youngbird from Oklahoma. So to close, next. And to close, amongst all these often complicated spiritual people in this room, he wrote of his art inspiration simply, "Pictures come to my mind, and I tell my heart to go ahead." Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to entertain some questions now for Lesley. Just raise your hand if you have one.
Actually, I just wondered if read this exhibition as a composition almost for reset finding mothers and fathers.
This is probably better. Okay. My mother taught public speaking in high school, and she always hated it if I had to use a microphone. So no, but it's better to hear than not to hear. Did you hear anything I said? Okay, okay, we can continue. Next.
What were some of the what prompted you to choose some of the colors and fabrics and materials for the various?
Well, I felt Anne Hutchinson had to be a deep blue and had to have the white Puritan-like collar, which actually I kind of invented. But I think that they, these spikes of spirituality, spirituality is not necessarily a soft, fluffy thing. It can be a spiky, energizing thing. So she's blue with the white collar, and also the cuffs inside. The fabric is orange, and of course the continual threads. Nathaniel Hawthorne also had to be in navy blue. I just think of all of his writing in navy blue for some reason. And we embroidered him with horsehair, and we embroidered Mary Rowlandson with horsehair, both of them, because they were really people from the wilderness. We'll switch. Way deep in the bristles of the forest. All those little bristles, forests are really bristly. And I grew up walking in the Adirondacks and Cape Cod and Maine. I am yours. But I also will let you go. So thank you so much. Thank you for coming tonight.